Imagine discovering a murder confession written in the margins of a Bible, preserved for more than 30 years in the attic of a church. Imagine that this confession finally reveals the truth about the disappearance of a devout woman who vanished during a religious service in the presence of hundreds of faithful believers who were praying beside her. In September 2024, Pastor Robert Miller was organizing donations of old books in the attic of Grace Baptist Church in Memphis, Tennessee, when he found a 1985 King James Bible, apparently forgotten for decades. As he leafed through its yellowed pages, he discovered something that made his blood run cold: a detailed confession about the murder of Brittany Johnson, written by hand in the margins of the Psalms. If you are watching this video, please subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. What you are about to discover will show how the most sacred places can hide the darkest secrets, and how truth, even when whispered only to God, eventually finds its way to the light. This is not just a story about an inexplicable disappearance. It is a story about how faith can be both a refuge for the innocent and a hiding place for the guilty, and about how a confession intended only for divine eyes ended up becoming the key to solving a mystery that haunted a congregation for more than 3 decades. Brittany Johnson disappeared on March 15, 1992, during a BPID revival service at Grace Baptist Church. For 32 years, her family, her church, and the Memphis community lived without answers. But the words written in the margins of a Bible would finally reveal a truth so disturbing that it would forever change how this congregation viewed the sanctity of their own temple. Brittany Johnson possessed that type of radiant faith that inspired other believers and made pastors smile when they saw her approaching the altar. At 26 years old, in 1992, she was a woman of 5 feet 5 inches tall, with blonde hair always arranged conservatively, blue eyes that sparkled especially during hymns, and a genuine smile that reflected an inner peace that many admired. But what really defined Brittany was not her angelic appearance. It was her absolute dedication to God, family, and the Grace Baptist Church community, where she had found not only faith, but also purpose and identity. Brittany had become a Christian at 18 years old during a turbulent period of her life when she struggled with depression and lack of direction after graduating from high school. She had grown up in a secular family and found in faith an anchor that completely transformed her perspective on life. Brittany always said that Jesus saved her twice, remembered her younger sister, Carol Johnson. First, he saved her soul. Then, he saved her life when she was at her lowest point. This conversion experience marked her deeply. In 1988, Brittany married Mark Johnson, a young deacon of Grace Baptist Church who shared her passion for ministry and Christian service. They had met during a youth retreat and discovered a spiritual compatibility that became the foundation of a solid and loving marriage. Together, Brittany and Mark had 2 children, Timothy, born in 1989, and Sarah, born in 1991. For Brittany, being a mother was a sacred vocation, a responsibility given by God to raise children in the discipline and admonition of the Lord, as she frequently quoted from Ephesians. Brittany's daily routine was structured around her faith and family. She woke up at 5:30 every morning for a period of prayer and Bible reading before the children woke up. After caring for Timothy and Sarah during the day, she dedicated afternoons to church activities, visiting elderly members, preparing meals for families in need, and helping with children's programs. At Grace Baptist Church, Brittany was known as someone who could be completely trusted. She led the women's Bible study group on Wednesdays, coordinated the children's worship ministry, and was frequently sought out by younger women seeking advice about marriage, motherhood, and Christian life. Brittany had this gift of making people feel heard and loved. Remembered Pastor Robert Miller, who had been assistant pastor at the time and knew Brittany well. She didn't judge, didn't gossip, and always directed people to Scripture when they needed guidance. Brittany's faith was practical and lived daily. She kept a spiritual journal where she recorded prayers, biblical reflections, and what she called evidence of God's grace in her everyday life. She had memorized hundreds of Bible verses and frequently quoted them in casual conversations, not in a pedantic way, but as someone who truly believed that God's Word had practical answers to life's challenges. Her relationships in the church were deep and genuine. Brittany had become especially close to several families in the congregation, frequently caring for children for parents who needed support, preparing meals for families in crisis, and offering a shoulder to cry on for women facing marital difficulties. Mark Johnson often joked that he had married the holiest woman in Memphis, but his admiration for Brittany was genuine. She perfectly balanced domestic life and ministry, always putting family first, but finding creative ways to serve God through her role as wife and mother. Brittany never did things to be seen or praised, Mark remembered years later. She served because she genuinely loved people and wanted to see them prosper spiritually. That's how she lived her faith. In the months leading up to March 1992, Brittany was particularly excited about a new ministry she had started at the church, a mentoring program for young women who were struggling with addictions, abusive relationships, or other difficulties. She had convinced Pastor Miller to allow the church to offer space and resources for this ministry, even though some more conservative members had reservations about bringing worldly problems into the church. Brittany believed that the church should be a hospital for sinners, not a museum for saints, Pastor Miller explained. She was always looking for ways to reach people that other Christians might consider too problematic. This compassionate heart sometimes created subtle tensions in the congregation. Some members thought Brittany was too liberal in her approach to ministry, while others saw her as a perfect example of how Christians should live. But even those who disagreed with some of her methods never questioned the sincerity of her faith or the purity of her motivations. Brittany also had a particular interest in missions, especially work with orphaned children in developing countries. She and Mark had begun saving money and praying about the possibility of becoming short-term missionaries, perhaps spending a year serving in an orphanage in Brazil or Africa. She always said she wanted to live a life that mattered for eternity, Carol remembered. Brittany wasn't interested in comfort or material security. She wanted to use every day that God gave her to make a difference in other people's lives. On the morning of March 15, 1992, Brittany woke up with her usual expectation. It was Sunday, and there was a special revival service that evening with a visiting evangelist preacher. She had spent the week praying and fasting, asking God to use the service to touch hearts and bring spiritual renewal to the congregation. During breakfast, Brittany read Psalm 27 aloud to the family, as she did every Sunday morning. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" She did not know that she was reading this psalm for the last time, or that the words about light and salvation would become sadly ironic when darkness engulfed her just hours later. Brittany Johnson spent her last moments doing exactly what she loved, worshiping God, surrounded by her family of faith, completely trusting in divine goodness and the protection of the Almighty. The tragedy that was about to unfold would show that even in the most sacred places, Evil can hide among the saints. Sunday, March 15th, 1992. A day that began with mourning, worship, and ended with an entire congregation in shock, questioning not only what had happened to Brittany Johnson, but how someone could simply disappear from the middle of a church full of people praying. The morning at the Johnson house proceeded with the usual tranquility of Sundays. Brittany woke up at 5:30 for her personal devotion time, prepared a special breakfast for the family, pancakes that the children loved, and helped Mark dress Timothy and Sarah in their best Sunday clothes. Mom was particularly cheerful that morning. Timothy, now an adult, remembers some fragments of that day. She hummed hymns while getting us ready for church and said she had high expectations for the evening service. The 10 o'clock morning service proceeded normally. Brittany participated actively in worship, took notes during the sermon, and talked animatedly with other members after the service about the special service that would be held that evening. Evangelist Dr. James Patterson had arrived from Nashville specifically to lead a week of revival at Grace Baptist Church. During lunch with the family, Brittany expressed excitement about Dr. Patterson's ministry. She had read some of his books on spiritual renewal and was eager to see how God would use his preaching to touch the congregation. Brittany could barely contain her anticipation, Mark remembered. She had been praying and fasting for the church for weeks, asking God to bring spiritual renewal. For her, this service represented an answer to her prayers. At 5:30 p.m., the Johnson family returned to Grace Baptist Church for the 6 p.m. revival service. The church was fuller than normal. Approximately 400 people had come specifically to hear Dr. Patterson, including visitors from other denominations and people who rarely attended religious services. Brittany chose to sit in the fourth row, on the right side, her usual position during special services, because it allowed her to see the pulpit clearly and participate actively in the service. Mark sat beside her, with Timothy on his lap and Sarah between them. The service began with 30 minutes of worship led by the church's music ministry. Brittany sang enthusiastically, raising her hands during some hymns, demonstrating the spiritual freedom that characterized her personal worship. At 6:45 p.m., Dr. Patterson stepped up to the pulpit to preach on personal awakening, based on Habakkuk 3:2. Lord, I have heard your word, and I feared. Revive, O Lord, your work in the midst of the years. During the first 45 minutes of the preaching, several people noticed that Brittany was particularly engaged, taking notes in her Bible and occasionally whispering, Amen, during especially impactful points of the sermon. At 7:30 p.m., Dr. Patterson made an appeal for people to come forward for special prayer and consecration. About 50 people responded to the call, including Brittany, who was one of the first to stand and walk toward the altar. Brittany always responded to appeals, remembered Margaret Foster, who sat behind the Johnson family. She never missed an opportunity to seek more of God or reaffirm her commitment to Christ. At the altar, Brittany knelt among other people seeking prayer. Dr. Patterson began praying for groups of people, laying hands and praying specifically for spiritual renewal and personal revival. At 7:45 p.m., Dr. Patterson initiated ABE, period of collective silent prayer, asking each person to pray individually while he circulated around the altar, offering personal prayer for those who desired it. It was during this period of silent prayer that Brittany Johnson disappeared. Mark, who had remained in his seat with the children, was casually observing the altar when he noticed that he could no longer see Brittany among the people kneeling. Initially, he assumed that she was simply in a different position, or perhaps had moved to a different area of the altar. But when the prayer period ended at 8:10 p.m. and people began returning to their seats, Brittany was not among them. Mark stood up and carefully examined the entire altar area. She was not there. He checked the women's restrooms, searched the side corridors, and even went outside to check the parking lot, thinking that perhaps she had gone out to get something from the car. Brittany had simply disappeared. At 8:15 p.m., Mark discreetly interrupted one of the deacons, David Miller, Pastor Miller's brother, to report that he could not find Brittany. David immediately organized an informal search, asking several men from the church to check all the rooms, closets, and areas of the building. Grace Baptist Church was a large building with multiple classrooms, offices, kitchen, gymnasium, and several exits. Theoretically, it would be possible for someone to leave discreetly during the confusion of the prayer period at the altar. But why would Brittany leave without telling Mark? And where would she have gone? At 8:30 p.m., when the informal search did not locate Brittany, Pastor Miller made the difficult decision to interrupt the service and ask for help from the entire congregation. He stepped up to the pulpit and explained that Brittany Johnson had disappeared during prayer at the altar. This created absolute silence in the church, Dr. Patterson remembered years later. In 25 years of evangelistic ministry, I had never experienced anything like this. It was as if a dark presence had invaded a sacred place. The entire congregation participated in the search. Men checked the exterior of the building. Women searched every internal room. Young people looked in closets and storage spaces. The parking lot was completely checked, as well as the surrounding property. There was no sign of Brittany anywhere. More disturbing still, her purse had been left under her original seat. Her car keys were in the purse. Her wallet was intact, and there was no evidence that she had planned to leave the church. At 9 p.m., when it became obvious that Brittany was not anywhere on the church property, Pastor Miller made the decision to call the police. The arrival of the police at Grace Baptist Church created a surreal scene. Uniformed officers investigating a disappearance in the middle of a congregation still gathered, all dressed in their best Sunday clothes, all trying to understand how someone could simply evaporate during a moment of prayer. Detective Christopher Jones, a 15-year veteran of the Memphis Police Department, took over the initial investigation. He had worked on hundreds of missing person cases, but never in a religious context, with so many potential witnesses present at the time of disappearance. The scene was unique, Detective Jones explained years later. You had 400 people who were all in the same building when Brittany disappeared, but because of the nature of the moment, silent prayer with closed eyes, nobody had actually seen what happened. The first priority was to preserve the scene and interview witnesses while the events were still fresh in their memories. The church was treated as a potential crime scene, although there was no obvious evidence of violence. Dr. Patterson, who had been leading the prayer at the altar, was one of the first people interviewed. He explained that during silent prayer, he had circulated around the altar praying for people individually, but did not specifically remember seeing Brittany after the first few minutes of the prayer period. I was focused on prayer and ministration, Dr. Patterson explained. During moments like that, I often enter a spiritual zone where I am concentrated only on God's presence and people's needs. I wasn't taking attendance or monitoring who was where. Several people who had been praying near Brittany at the altar were interviewed in detail. Margaret Chen, who had knelt immediately to Brittany's right, remembered that Brittany was praying fervently during the first 10 to 15 minutes of the silent prayer period. I could hear her whispering prayers, Margaret said. She was clearly very spiritually engaged. But at some point, I don't know exactly when, I realized I didn't hear her anymore. When I opened my eyes, she was no longer there. The investigation of the church's physical structure revealed multiple exits that Brittany could have used to leave the building without being noticed during prayer at the altar. There were 2 side exits, 1 back exit, and the main entrance, all accessible from the altar area without passing through the main congregation. But why would she leave? And more importantly, where would she have gone? The first theory investigated was that Brittany had experienced some type of medical or emotional emergency that forced her to leave the service abruptly. Sometimes, during moments of intense spiritual experience, people can feel overwhelmed and need fresh air or space to process emotions. But this theory did not explain why Brittany had not returned, or why she had not signaled to Mark that she was leaving, or why she had left her purse behind. The second line of investigation focused on the possibility that Brittany had met someone she knew outside the church. Perhaps she had seen a friend or family member in the parking lot and stepped out briefly to talk, perhaps planning to return quickly. Investigators interviewed all of Brittany's family members and close friends. Nobody had been in the church area that night, and nobody had made plans to meet Brittany. The third possibility, and the most disturbing, was that Brittany had been approached by someone with malicious intentions. But this raised puzzling questions. How would a stranger have gained access to the church during a service? How could they have convinced Brittany to leave without causing a commotion? And why choose such a public and risky moment? The investigation expanded to examine everyone present at the service that night. Pastor Miller provided a list of church members, but there were also many visitors, people from other denominations, friends brought by members, and even some curious individuals who had come specifically to hear Dr. Patterson. Interviewing 400 people was a massive task, Detective Jones observed, and many of them were visitors that we had no easy way to track down. Some people had left immediately after discovering the disappearance before we could get their names and contact information. A significant discovery came from analyzing the church attendance list. In the records kept by the ushers, there were at least 15 to 20 people present that night who could not be completely identified. Visitors who had signed only first names or who had left inaccurate contact information. More worrying still, several church members mentioned having noticed some men who seemed out of place during the service, people who did not actively participate in worship, who seemed to be observing the congregation more than engaging in the religious service. But in a church that regularly received visitors and encouraged evangelism, the presence of unknown people was not uncommon or necessarily suspicious. The investigation also carefully examined Brittany's personal life for possible motives for voluntary disappearance. Detailed interviews with Mark revealed an apparently solid marriage without significant financial or relational problems. Brittany was genuinely happy, Mark insisted during multiple interviews. She loved our life, loved the children, loved the church. There were no problems at home that would make her want to disappear. It simply doesn't make sense. Brittany's colleagues in church ministry confirmed that she had been planning future activities and showing enthusiasm about long-term projects. She had not exhibited signs of depression, anxiety, or discontent that could suggest suicidal tendencies or voluntary flight. As days turned into weeks, the investigation began to focus on a more sinister possibility, that Brittany had been the victim of a carefully planned crime by someone who knew her routines and had deliberately chosen the moment of silent prayer to approach her. But who could have had access to both the church and detailed knowledge of Brittany's movements? And how could they have convinced a cautious and intelligent woman to leave a safe environment? The impact of the disappearance on Grace Baptist Church was devastating. The congregation, which had gathered for celebration and spiritual renewal, was left with questions that challenged their faith and their sense of security in their own temple. It changed the atmosphere of the church forever, Pastor Miller reflected. People began looking around during services, questioning whether they were really safe. Innocence was lost. In June 1992, 3 months after the disappearance, the case was transferred to the Cold Case Division of the Police Department. Without physical evidence, without witnesses to the actual crime, and without viable leads, active investigation was suspended. Brittany Johnson had become another ghost haunting a community, another family shattered by unanswered questions, another mystery that challenged both investigators and people of faith. But somewhere in the pages of a Bible, the confession was waiting to reveal the truth about what really happened during that night of silent prayer. The 32 years that followed Brittany Johnson's disappearance were a journey of tested faith, persistent hope, and the slow reconciliation between spiritual beliefs and a reality that seemed to contradict everything that Grace Baptist Church represented about divine protection and sacred community. Mark Johnson faced perhaps the most complex challenge of all, raising Timothy and Sarah as a single father while keeping alive the memory of a mother who had simply evaporated during a moment of worship. How do you explain to small children that Mommy disappeared while praying? Daddy always told us that Mommy was with Jesus, Timothy remembered from his childhood. But as we grew up, we began asking harder questions. If Mommy was with Jesus, why didn't she say goodbye? Why did God allow something to happen to her in church, of all places? Mark never remarried, dedicating his life completely to his children and the search for answers about Brittany's fate. He became obsessed with the case, maintaining correspondence with private investigators, following every lead no matter how remote, and praying daily for revelation about what had happened to his wife. Dad aged 20 years in the first 5 years after Mom's disappearance, Sarah observed. He never stopped looking, never stopped believing we would find answers. His faith was impressive, but also painful to watch. Timothy Johnson grew up with the determination to one day discover the truth about his mother. At 18 years old, he enlisted in the military police, partially motivated by a desire to develop investigative skills that he could apply to Brittany's case. After serving 4 years in the Army, he returned to Memphis and joined the local police department. I became a police officer to find my mother, Timothy admitted years later. It was a powerful motivation, but also unhealthy. It took me years to understand that I needed to live my own life, not just search for answers about hers. Sarah chose a different path, but equally influenced by the trauma. She became a Christian counselor, specializing in helping families who had faced traumatic losses. Her own experience made her uniquely qualified to understand the complex intersection between faith, trauma, and the grieving process. Losing Mom the way we did created deep theological questions, Sarah explained. As a family of faith, we were forced to wrestle with questions about God's goodness, divine protection, and why terrible things happen to good people in sacred places. Grace Baptist Church also underwent profound transformations in the years after Brittany's disappearance. Pastor Robert Miller, who had been assistant pastor in 1992, assumed the main leadership of the church in 2000 and made finding answers about Brittany a personal ministerial priority. Brittany wasn't just a church member, Pastor Miller explained. She represented the heart of what our community aspired to be: genuine faith, sacrificial service, unconditional love. Losing her in this way not only broke our hearts, it challenged our understanding of how God operates in the world. Every year, on the anniversary of Brittany's disappearance, the church organized a special memorial service. These services became powerful moments of remembrance, but also of deep theological questioning. How could a congregation maintain faith in divine protection when one of their most devoted members had disappeared from within the sanctuary itself? The church grew significantly during the 2000s and 2010s, but the shadow of Brittany's mystery remained. New members always eventually heard the story, and many were disturbed by the idea that something so sinister could have happened in a place that should be safe refuge. Some new members chose to join other churches after learning about Brittany, Pastor Miller admitted. The story made them question whether our church was somehow cursed or whether God was really present with us. But for many long-standing members, Brittany's mystery became part of the church's identity, a constant reminder of the fragility of human life and the need to value every moment they had together as a community of faith. During the 2010s decade, several false leads renewed hopes. In 2014, a woman in Nevada contacted police claiming to be Brittany Johnson, but DNA tests proved she was not related to the family. In 2018, human remains were found in a rural area outside Memphis, but again, tests proved they were not Brittany's. Each false alarm was devastating, Mark Johnson explained. For a few days or weeks, we thought we would finally have answers, only to discover it was another dead end. Timothy Johnson, now a respected detective in the Memphis Police Department, occasionally had access to his mother's case, files through official channels. He applied modern investigative techniques to old evidence, but without significant success. As a professional, I knew that the chances of solving a 30-year-old case were extremely low, Timothy observed. But as a son, I could never completely accept that. Modern technology brought new possibilities. DNA analysis, expanded criminal databases, and advanced forensic techniques offered periodic hopes of breakthrough. But Brittany's case had been unique because there was no significant physical evidence to analyze, only the mystery of how someone could disappear from a building full of people. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, when many churches were forced to operate with limited capacity, Pastor Miller spent significant time organizing and digitizing the church's historical archives. He discovered boxes of items that had been stored in the attic for decades: old church bulletins, photographs of events, and old ministerial equipment. It was a massive project, Pastor Miller explained. Decades of church history were piled in the attic, much of it never properly organized or cataloged. During this organization process, Pastor Miller found items dating back to the 80s and 90s, including materials that had been used during the March 1992 revival services. Photographs of Dr. Patterson preaching, lists of people who had responded to appeals, and even notes that Pastor Miller had made as assistant pastor during that fateful week. But it was only in September 2024, during a final attic cleaning before planned renovations, that Pastor Miller made the discovery that would change everything. September 2024. Pastor Robert Miller, now 67 years old and planning his retirement, was conducting a final cleaning of Grace Baptist Church's attic when he made the most shocking discovery of his 45 years of ministry. The church attic had served as storage for decades, accumulating layers of ministerial history. Old sound equipment, seasonal decorations, worn furniture, and boxes of documents that nobody had reviewed in years. During the pandemic, Pastor Miller had begun an ambitious organization project, but there were still areas that needed attention. I was essentially doing ministerial archaeology, Pastor Miller explained, finding things that had been forgotten for 20, 30, even 40 years. In a particularly disorganized area of the attic, behind a pile of broken chairs and old Sunday school materials, Pastor Miller discovered a wooden box marked only with Ministerial materials, 1980s. Inside the box were items that clearly had belonged to various church members over the years. Old hymnals, worn Bibles, devotional books, and notebooks with sermon annotations. Many of the items had names written on the first page, indicating their original owners. Among these items was a 1985 King James Bible, bound in worn black leather, with no name on the cover but clearly well used. Yellowed pages, margin annotations, and markers of favorite verses indicated that it had belonged to someone with active faith and regular Bible study. Pastor Miller opened the Bible casually, initially just checking if there was any identification of the owner. On the title page, written in faded blue ink, was a name that made his heart stop. Property of Brittany Johnson, 1985. When I saw her name, I almost dropped the Bible, Pastor Miller remembered. Brittany always carried a Bible during services, but I didn't remember her having a specific copy that she used only at home or for personal study. With trembling hands, Pastor Miller began leafing through the pages of Brittany's Bible. The margins were filled with her personal annotations, spiritual reflections, written prayers, cross-references to other verses, and quotes from devotional books she had read. But as he continued leafing through, he discovered something that was not Brittany's annotations. In the book of Psalms, pages 23 through 27, there were written in the margins annotations in a completely different handwriting. Masculine letters, more recent black ink, words written with an urgency that contrasted drastically with Brittany's gentle spiritual reflections. And these annotations were not Bible studies. They were a confession. Written in the EE margins of Psalm 23, where Brittany had previously underlined, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil," were the words, "I killed her. God forgive me, but I killed her." Pastor Miller sat heavily in an old chair, his hands trembling as he continued reading the words written in the margins of Brittany's Psalms. Throughout several pages, a complete confession was written in the margins. March 15, 1992. I could no longer bear to see her. Brittany, with her perfect faith, her perfect family, her perfect life. She made the rest of us look like failures as Christians. During prayer, I approached her. I said there was a family emergency in the pastor's office. She followed me without questioning. She trusted me because I had been a church member for years. In the back hallway, away from the others, I lost control. I grabbed her neck. She tried to scream, but I covered her mouth. Her eyes still haunt me. She didn't understand why I was doing that. It took only a few minutes. When it was over, I carried her body to the church basement. There was a crawl space behind the furnace that nobody ever checked. I put her there, sealed the opening with boards I found in storage. I returned to the sanctuary as if nothing had happened. When Mark started looking for her, I helped in the search. I pretended to be worried. I even cried during prayers for her family. Brittany Johnson is buried under our own church. For 32 years, we have worshipped over her grave. Every Sunday, I sat in the pews knowing she was right beneath our feet. The confession continued for several pages, detailing not only the crime, but years of guilt, attempts at religious justification, and finally, repentance. The last entry was dated just 2 weeks earlier. I have cancer. The doctors say I have a few months. I cannot meet God knowing that I carried this secret for so many years. Her family deserves to know. The church deserves to know. Brittany deserves justice, even if delayed. When I die, someone will find this confession. Maybe Pastor Miller, during a church cleaning. Maybe it is God's will that the truth finally come out. The confession was signed. David Miller, Deacon, Grace Baptist Church, 1975 through 2024. Pastor Miller stared at the signature in total shock. David Miller, his own older brother, who had served as deacon in the church for almost 50 years, who had helped in the search for Brittany that terrible night, who had consoled Mark and the children during years of uncertainty. His own brother had murdered Brittany Johnson and kept the secret for 32 years. Pastor Miller immediately called the police, his hands still trembling, as he held the Bible that contained the most bizarre murder confession Memphis had ever seen. The discovery not only solved the 32-year mystery of Brittany Johnson's disappearance, but revealed a truth that would challenge everything Grace Baptist Church thought it knew about faith, community, and the people they trusted most deeply. The truth had been written in the margins of Brittany's own Bible, waiting 3 decades to be discovered by someone who was looking for God's history, only to find a confession from the devil. The discovery of David Miller's confession in Brittany Johnson's Bible unleashed an investigation that revealed a truth more disturbing than any theory that had been considered during the 32 years of mystery. David Miller had died of cancer just 1 week before Pastor Robert Miller found the confession. He had spent his last days meticulously planning for the truth to be discovered after his death, placing Brittany's Bible in a location where his brother would inevitably find it during the attic cleaning. The immediate forensic investigation of Grace Baptist Church confirmed the details of the confession. In the church basement, exactly where David had described, investigators found a false wall behind the old furnace. Behind that wall were the mortal remains of Brittany Johnson, preserved for 3 decades in the dry and isolated space. "It was the most disturbing discovery of my career," said Detective Martinez, who led the renewed investigation. Knowing that for 32 years, hundreds of people worshipped directly over the victim's grave, including her own family, was deeply disturbing. Psychological analysis of the confession revealed that David Miller had developed a sick obsession with Brittany Johnson over the years. He saw her as a threat to his own image as a dedicated Christian, feeling that her genuine faith and sacrificial service exposed his own spiritual hypocrisy. David had been living a Christian facade for decades, explained Dr. Sarah Thompson, forensic psychologist who analyzed the confession. Brittany represented everything he pretended to be, but knew he wasn't. This created a resentment that eventually exploded into violence. For Mark, Timothy, and Sarah Johnson, the discovery brought both relief and renewed horror. Finally, they had answers about Brittany's fate, but they also discovered that she had been killed by someone they had trusted, someone who had consoled them during decades of grief. "David Miller prayed with us," Mark said, his voice breaking during an interview. "He held my hands during prayer vigils for Brittany. He hugged my children when they cried for their mother. And all that time, he knew exactly where she was." Grace Baptist Church faced an unprecedented crisis of faith. How could a congregation reconcile the fact that one of their most respected leaders had committed murder and kept the secret while leading worship over his victim's grave? This forced us to confront difficult truths about human nature and how evil can hide behind religiosity, Pastor Robert Miller explained during a special sermon after the discovery. Brittany Johnson, finally, received a proper burial, 32 years after her death. The entire Memphis community attended to honor a woman whose faith had been genuine, in contrast to the deadly hypocrisy of her murderer. Today, Grace Baptist Church maintains a permanent memorial for Brittany, reminding the congregation that true faith is measured not by external appearances, but by the integrity of the heart. Sometimes, Truth is written in the margins, waiting to be discovered by those willing to look in the most unlikely places.